Okay, cool, so we've got something new and fresh for the channel today. I'm actually going to be breaking down a sample-based hip-hop track in my Maschine MK3. Now, I think I'm going to break this video up into two parts, and the first part is going to be about working classic style drum breaks to your track, and then in the second part we're going to do a deep dive into sample slicing and record chopping, and I'm going to show you a couple of my favourite techniques. Okay, right, so we're actually going to start with a little bit of processing, and for this track I really wanted to have that old school gritty MPC 60s style sound, and so I've actually put a Decimort on my master track here in Maschine, and I did this right in the beginning and I ran all my sounds and my groups into this track. So what's happening here is I'm trying to emulate that 12-bit crunchy sound of the MPC 60, and so I've set the bit depth to 12. I'm doing a bit of preamp drive, and then I've pulled down the sample rate reduction just a little bit here. Okay, wicked, so let's dive into the drums. I've kept everything nice and simple in traditional Boom-Bap style, and here I've just got a drum break from, actually it's from a Pull Nice drum library loop, but it sounds a little bit like a classic break to me, and I think it's really good to show this technique with. Now, I know a lot of you will put, when you cut up your drums, you will probably use lots of individual slices, or you will even use one-shot hits for all of your drums. But actually, a technique we use a lot in drum and bass and jungle is to use longer slices of a drum break and to have all the chops chop each other off. And this technique will make more sense as I go through it, but I think it's a very viable technique for hip hop here as well. And the only thing to really note is that you need a drum break that's going to be slower than the actual BPM of your track, and this is going to make all the chops work perfectly when we go through this process. Okay, so the first thing you've got to do is set your BPM, and I've gone for 86 here, and that's a little bit slow for hip hop, but I've wanted to go for a little bit more of a laid back feeling with this track. And then I have my drum break. Now, I don't know which BPM this drum break was when I brought it in, but I have a feeling it's not going to work with this tempo that I've got. And if I just play one note for you now, we should be able to hear that it's going to sound a little bit stunted as it loops back around. So you can see it sounds a little bit weird there at the turnaround because it's not at the right speed for this track. So the way this technique actually works is firstly we're going to come into sampling, and then we go into slice mode, and in slice if you come to detect you get this sensitivity slider, and I'm just going to turn this up until I have all the hits, so all of the shakers, all the ghost notes, all the kicks and snares. I kind of want everything in this track to be in there, and that's looking pretty good for me there. So I've gone to 80%, and that's perfectly got all the slices for me, and I can test some of them here. Perfect, so it's picked up all of those little hits. So the next thing we're going to do is apply this to this track, or this sound even, and then I'm going to hit OK. One thing to note there is you really want this plus patterns setting turned on, and that's going to mean that all this MIDI data is going to come through as well. So now if I actually just trigger all these slices looping in this way, you'll hear it's going to loop perfectly with our track. Cool, so that's working a lot better, and we haven't changed the pitch, we haven't time stretched it. All we're doing actually is cutting off some of the ends of the samples or of the hits to make it all fit together. Now this part is really optional, but you can quantize some of these main hits. So I'm looking really at the main sort of kick and snare hits here. So it'd be kind of that. Cool, so I'm going to quantize the main quarter notes of this beat and just hit quantize for them. I've actually got to turn on quantize here and just quantize them, and it's going to make sense in a second, but the next thing we've got to do is actually take the recording of this drum break and bounce it back out. So in Maschine you can just drag that thing across, and now I have this audio region So here to here, what you actually got to do is go internal and then change the audio back to a sampler instrument. And then I'm going to come back into sampling, come back into edit, and I've just got to trim up. It's a bit weird that it gives you that ending in Maschine, but I've got to trim up the ending, and so I'm just looking where it becomes complete silence here right at the end. Can you see it just goes to a flat line about there? So truncate the sample, and then now when I go into slice again, I can come into split, and I can split this into 8 even parts. And because we quantized it at all the quarter notes, all of these slices are going to line up perfectly now when we play them on the grid. And so you can kind of demo this here. So now we've got this all sliced up, we can actually apply this to a sound or a group. And I would actually almost always go and apply this to a new group. So you just hit a new group button there and then hit OK. Because you get a lot more flexibility when you slice up the break and have it all on individual pads. So you can see if we follow the kick snare pattern that we have on this grid here, I have all my kicks on these chops. So on 1, 5, 3 and 7 I have my kicks, and then I have the snares on 2, 6, 4 and 8. And I could even colour them up. And so we can kind of mess around with either the kicks and the snares and create loads of new variations of that original idea by just sort of moving a blue note around to another blue note and a kick around and then another blue. And so you can mess with the break and just reconstruct your breaks using these longer slices. But because we went through all that effort before, everything's going to work out perfectly to your BPM, and it's all going to be nice and tight. And it's going to roll around really nicely, and you won't have any of these hits that are sort of snagging on the ends of new hits and getting in the way of things. Right, so there's a few more settings you actually need to turn on, and firstly we're going to go and select all these samples, and I'm going to go and put on polyphony onto 1, and that's going to mean that only one voice can play at a time. And then I actually want to choke all of these samples against each other, and that means whenever I trigger a new sample, it's going to cut off the previous pad. And it works very similar to how polyphony works, but it works across multiple pads. So essentially the samples are going to chop themselves off, and they're going to chop off with each other, and that's the whole point of doing that. So now we've got everything nicely set up, I would usually go through and make a couple of variations of my drum patterns, and this is just getting a basic structure and some basic variations that I can call upon later. And here I'm really focusing on obviously going through the chops one by one, and then also I like to add lots of double notes and double kicks and double snares at this point as well, just to give the groove some interest. And you can quite clearly see I'm not very good at playing live on these pads at all, and I'm much more of a programmer, but actually it's really easy to get something that starts to sound quite good if you follow this technique of having slightly longer slices, because you don't have to program all the hits and stuff. You're just hitting one pad at a time, but then you get all the shuffles coming with your kicks and snares. Now, to give it a little bit more interesting, I'm going to start adding some accent kicks and some ghost snares, and the simplest version of these is really to just take your kick or your snare and to lower it in velocity, and then to throw it a little bit off the grid, usually a little bit before or after the snare. And this is going to help give you that swung feel, and I would almost always just do this by hand, and it's really easy. You just kind of throw something in like that and just listen and keep playing with different positions till you find something that's going to work. So maybe this could have another little kick here. Let's lower that one. Now that's got a little bit too much groove happening there. Cool, so I've gone through now, and you can see I've just added a few of these accent kicks and snares, and you can take this as far as you want, but you really just want to introduce a few more notes, and they're not supposed to be really prominent notes, but just to help with the groove and the shuffle of things, and to help things move along a little bit and not be so static. One thing that's very common to do is to use fills to spice up the turnarounds or the ends of these passages. And it's obviously very good to do this just in the pattern here and to add little bits of interest. But another thing I really like to do is actually to use fill sections in Maschine. And what I mean by this is actually if I jump to my track a little bit here, I have this scene that I've created, and it's only a 2-bar scene. And what it is in the first bar, the song is continuing as normal, and then in the second bar, it actually jumps to a fill section. And this is going to help me lead from different parts of my track, and I'll get much more into this in the arrangement stage, but I have a very basic structure in this track which really goes from a passage, which is like a verse, into a B passage, which is like a chorus. And so to get myself from the verse to the chorus, or from the chorus to the verse, I use these little fill sections, and this is really about breaking out of the kind of loop cycle. So here's the A pattern playing here. And you can hear there, it goes around normally, and then it has this little fill, and I've done it in the drums and in the chops. I've done specific fill style chops right at the end, just for that 1 bar there to help turn the whole thing around and to lead me into that new passage. Anyway, so what I would really do there is, for this, I don't really want all the shakers. I just want to isolate that kick. So I would actually just duplicate this pad up to another pad, maybe give it a new color like yellow, and then I can just come into edit and just make that a really short kick. And now I can just program that kick individually, and that's why I would always recommend having all these slices as pads rather than all being on one sound. So if I duplicate a scene, and then I can right click and I can go unique. So now we've got this scene, and this has actually created a new pattern. And then I could shrink this right down to 2 bars and then just delete the end. And so it's going to start normally. And then I can load up my fill section. As well as using accent kicks, ghost snares and fills and rolls, we can also use other drum layers to give interest to our drum break and to layer on top of it. One very classic thing to do is to use a ride sample, but what you will often find when you use a ride is that it doesn't fit with the drums that you have there, and this is often because you're using an old school sounding crunchy drum break, and then you're putting one-shot samples or a drum machine ride over the top of it, and they're just from completely different acoustic spaces. And so what we've got to do is roughen up our drum hits to make them work with some of these old school sounding breaks. And if you actually listen to the track here, if I go to sort of this main section, I have this ride sample here on number 13. And if you listen to that ride, it's got loads of crackling, it's got loads of noise in as well. It's a really dirty sample of a ride, but actually it works really well on top of the break. Anyway, it's actually really easy to make these dusty samples, and we can very quickly do this in Maschine. And so what I've got here is 3 samples at the bottom of this track. I've got a ride sample here. I've got some crackle. And then I've got some frying, sizzling noise that I made recording myself using a frying pan or frying bacon, I think, or maybe even pancakes. And what we've got to do really is just control the envelopes of all the samples so they're all going to fade off at the same time as the ride. So I'm going to pull down sustain. So I'm turning on ADSR, and then I'm going to pull down sustain. And then I'm just going to mess with decay. So that's actually got a bit, the ride had a bit longer of decay. That's pretty good. So 2.3 seconds, and I'm just triggering the pads at the same time there. So let's do this with the crackle as well. So what was it, 2.3 seconds. Cool, and then we can just try and trigger them. So now they're all sounding nicely, playing at all the same time, and the envelopes are the same. What we can do is select these samples and actually put them on a link group. So when we just trigger one of the samples, they're all going to play. And I need to actually put ADSR on this hit as well. So let's make them all 2.3 and let's take off sustain. Maybe we just mess with the volumes a little bit here. And now we have them all playing together. What I would do is actually just sample them out. So if I hit this, let's just loop this one pattern. And I can take this sample out, and now this should be the sample in itself. And let's turn this into a sampler instrument. Turn this one back up, maybe come into sampling actually and just normalize it. It's quite loud now. Cool, so now we have the sample as one entity and we can trigger it with one shot, or we can do whatever we want with it. And we've got a very similar sounding ride sample to the one I had in my track. And it's really just noise and vinyl crackle layered on top of a ride. And that's really going to dust it up for you. So the one thing is that they weren't really working with my beat this ride. The other ride I had in my track was working really nicely, but that one was sounding just a little bit off. And so I've tried pitching it up a semitone just to see if that's going to help it a little bit. Finally, I just want to go through some of the processing on the breaks. I haven't done any processing to the individual sounds. I've really just done it to the whole group. And I've kept it very simple, true to the style. And so I've done a little bit of compression here with the Volve compressor. And then I'm using this RX 950 is going to do, it's doing a little bit of bandwidth reduction. If you hear, if I turn this up. It's somewhere around there. You can really hear in the hi-hat, it just pulls some of that top end out of it. And I always feel when you listen back to this style, you're never hearing a very digital sounding hi-hat. So just kind of pulling the drums, the upper frequencies of the drums, it's very similar to using a filter that. And then I'm also monoing the drums out completely, so they're going right down the middle. And then finally I'm using just a little bit of limiting. And this is like a saturator on the limiter, this XL command. But you can see I'm not really doing a lot with these drums at all, and I'm just getting a little bit of level and a little bit of sort of compression and limiting out of these drums. Okay, wicked. So that really wraps up the first part of this tutorial, and I just wanted to show you there how to take a classic break and really make it work with your track in Maschine. And I showed you a couple of examples of ways we can add interest and develop our drum beats. So in the next part, we're going to go over record chopping and a bunch of slicing techniques, and we're really going to show you how we can develop a track and kind of put all these things together. So I'll catch you very soon on my channel. Peace.